this is kind of a little different for me, but I came into the library and looked at the space and was trying to make something that would be informative and locate people in the space. And so I did this map, but it's a map of the Tongva area, but it's all in the traditional village site names. And so I wanted to give that information and have people somewhat recognize the spaces, but not to kind of introduce them to the original place names. And some are familiar, like Topanga, right? Malibu, or Cahuenga. Like, these are places that we kind of know and have heard, but maybe don't realize that they have Tongva origins or what their meanings are. And then I am putting in these kind of mapping points of my own personal history, of places I've lived, places I've worked on sites, places that are significant that I know of, that I've visited with my father or my family. And so it has a kind of educational bend, but also has this personal story entwined, because I feel like when you talk about a place and when you talk about a history, it's really the people and the stories that make it alive, and to kind of explain that Tongva still exists and that we're still around and we have connections to some of these places, or a lot of these places, and kind of to enliven that story.
So what is the significance of the red yarn?
Yeah, the red yarn I started using after I worked on a site as a cultural resource consultant when we were preparing ancestors for reburial, and all of the sage that we were using was wrapped in red yarn because that's what we were given by a very generous man, one of my father's friends. And so through that process, the material became super present, and the remnants of this red yarn were everywhere because we were going through so many of these bundles of sage because of the volume of, it was a cemetery, so there were more than 1,000 people. So it was a lot. And so it kind of became this this impression on me. And so that's where that specific material came in. And then I also, working on these sites where excavation is happening, it's often these meter squares that are delineated in the ground and tied off with little red, or usually it's like bright pink for some reason, or orange, these bright colors so you don't trip over it probably. But these squares that are kind of put down in the earth. And so it's it was always an odd visual and an odd experience to see like a hillside or a kind of organic shape, and then you have this like little square cut out of it that kind of would move and morph into bigger squares. And so I was always like super impressed by the people who made those, because it's like a skill, right? Yeah. To make these beautiful squares. But really in my own practice, looking at that, like these sites of excavation, and we all kind of go through this process of excavating our own personal histories or our cultural histories or the place where we live. And so it's kind of this delineation of space to explore. So, all of my work kind of comes out of my experience, because I feel like that's where I can speak from, because that's what I've experienced in the world, and that's where I've been and what I've seen. And so I also do a ton of research, and I do a ton of trying to gather information and piece things back together. So I do feel like I'm always working in these two levels of kind of the personal stories that echo the larger stories, or vice versa.
Can you tell us about these Cog Stones?
Yes. So also working on these sites, there was one in particular where we found these stone-carved objects that are called Cog Stones. And as I always say, I kind of hate this name. I want to rename them, and I probably will at some point. But they're these really beautiful, very intentional, very intricate objects, but we don't know what they were used for. And so it's a really kind of hard thing to understand, that your culture and your history has been so kind of erased and like decimated, that these things that are so important and special, we've lost that meaning. And so as kind of an act of empowerment, I decided that I was going to make them myself. I don't really have personal access to these collections, and I wanted to use them as objects because I feel like they tell an interesting story. And so I started making them, and I actually cast them out of concrete because I'm not a stone carver. Maybe one day I'll get good enough to make these out of stone. But I was casting them out of concrete also because this experience of working like just below this layer of concrete or asphalt that so often you're working below on these sites that the history and the things and the people are, I think it's not more than like that.
It's just mere
Yeah,
edges.
it's barely below the surface. And so often I make these on arrange them on a plane, so they kind of create this like plane of concrete, like a level of concrete to kind of work through. So they don't have an official meaning, but I wanted to kind of give them my own personal meaning. And for me, they become these mapping stars of like, and so I often say like, oh, I think they're for mapping for when you go out to be able to come back, or to kind of map the stars or kind of have this movement between worlds, because that's what I would like them to be. I think that's like a really beautiful interpretation. And I also like the experience of often they create this night sky effect. You know, I use cinnamon and salt and these star shapes because I feel like we've all had this experience of looking at the night sky and being in awe of that. You know, most people have had that kind of moment. And so they're very culturally important, historically and personally, but so the objects have all this meaning, but on a just generic, well, maybe not generic, but a general level, people can still access them and have this experience because of the connection with the sky.
Is that what we're going for with this type of installation?
I mean, this is a little bit different because normally I kind of actually create a more almost like a constellation on a pedestal that I paint, you know. So this is a little different. With the map is kind of new, and I really wanted it to be something almost closer to these kind of coordinates and intersections of people and places, and some of these tie back into locations where they've been found. So it's a little bit more of trying to bring some of the experience of the places like off the wall, off a map, out of history, and kind of locate them in a tangible way.
Yeah, making them fully dimensional, three-dimensional
Yeah.
things, including time and location, seems to be a heavy theme in here.
Yeah.
I'm really a big fan. I don't know if you're getting
Yeah.
this. I'm really
Thank you.
So, you mentioned the salt and the cinnamon.
Yeah.
What's the significance behind that besides, is it just for the star night effect?
Well, the cinnamon I started working with because it visually is very similar to ochre, which is a traditional ceremonial material, but often it's located in places in the landscape that I don't have access to, or we don't have access to anymore. So sometimes, you know, I'll work on a site, or my dad will, and people give it to him, and so he has some, but it would really mean me going and like digging in people's like hillsides or like parks, you know, like, so I don't have access to this material. And so for me, it's like, well, how can this persist if I don't have access to the materials? And so I started to say, well, what if I exchange that material for something that's very similar? It could look or feel the same way. Does it change it, or does it keep it alive? And, you know, kind of trying to keep things living and breathing, working within what I still have, or what I have access to in the moment. And the salt came in actually when I did the show at SMOA with matriarchs, because I was trying to look at the specific area and the bays. And I have more knowledge north, like not that much north of here, but a bit north of here. And so I was reading that a little south of here, there was salt gathering happening. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was an interesting, I'd never heard that before. Like, and sometimes I read things and I'm like, okay, I need to like double check this. But I just like that idea of collection and a resource and something that is always, or has historically been this valuable thing that like literally, you know, like spices caused wars, you know, but because of our location being close to the ocean and the sea, and it talks of like the abundance of resources that existed in this place, and like I feel like that's always important to remember too, of how people used and managed resources in the past.
Oh, definitely.
So,
shapes cultures.
Yeah.
And so moving on to our last piece on here. So I see the shell and the sage. What's
Yeah.
going on with that?
So the abalone is something that always has been kind of part of the ceremonies that I've been involved with, and it also, so it has this kind of cultural connection. Now they usually don't look like this because when they're really used, they're burned and get very dark and brown, and so some of the color goes out. But it also is this item that connects us to the ocean, and then you think about resources again and how for a long time it was so depleted because it was over harvested, and then it kind of came back in, and now there are bans again. So like it's like kind of this interesting resource that's seen as valuable and has importance, but it's always in this kind of flux of trying to kind of persist as well. So I use that. And then the sage is really just kind of to reference that experience of working on these sites with kind of this cleansing impulse, and kind of just using that as a reference to that experience.
What do you hope that people learn or take away from your art piece here in El Segundo?
Sure. I mean, one, just that there are kind of living, breathing indigenous people of this area who still are around. I feel like sometimes the history is, because it's been erased in a lot of places from like your grade school textbooks, where I mean I was taught history started when the mission people came up, right? And that was like your California history. So I like that I wanted to give information. That's not usually, like, I'm not usually this word based, but I just wanted to kind of have an awareness and some of the familiarity of recognizing where the culture still kind of exists, and then for people to be able to interact with the space and the objects and their own curiosity and maybe want to explore more. Like I always hope to spark some sort of curiosity. For me, for my work, for my story, there's not really a way to say, okay, here's everything right here, here's the story, you got it, and you can walk away feeling like you know everything, because that's not even my experience, you know? I'm always still kind of working, learning the language again, I don't even know all these by heart, you know? Like, I'm still learning too. And so I always want people to kind of maybe spark their curiosity to want to go out and find more, research more, explore more, recognize something, and they go, oh, right, I remember that here, like having that reference point to remember the pre-mission, kind of Los Angeles.
Bridging the disconnect that we have between our history in the past and present.
Yeah.
That's very, very cool.
Yeah, and there's Tongva people all over Los Angeles doing work, revitalizing the language, working in universities, working in cultural institutions, really trying to kind of keep the story in the forefront of people's consciousness. There's a lot of things happening right now with land acknowledgements of like, whose land are we on, and understanding that the territory was never ceded, or these treaties that were supposed to be ratified to actually give some sort of land to the people never got ratified. So there's all these kind of larger stories that get bigger than the immediate place, but they're really important to understand, to know why we're kind of in the situation we're in right now. So
how has it been working with the Arts and Culture Committee of El Segundo?
Yeah, it's been really nice. I mean, I got introduced to everybody through Kristen, through the Matriarch show, and it just seems like everybody's really open and interested and kind of ready to hear, which is a nice feeling. Working with Nanava on the mural and having those conversations was really interesting, and connecting with her and her similar impulse, even though she's not from here, she's of another place, but we still have this kind of impulse to kind of bring the culture into the present moment. And I feel like that has been really accepted by everybody we've worked with so far here. So it's been great.